There are two sets of papers which you won't have any of in front of you, but you will get them. They're either downloadable or will be sent by email. So there's a detailed paper on operational finance, profit fit, and then there's a copy of all the slides that you'll see today. So you can take notes furiously if you'd like to, and if that's the way you learn, well, that's good, that's fine, no problem, but otherwise you do get the materials available, either downloadable or I can email them to you or Gary can email them to you. So today we're going to look at this fairly broad subject, and what I intend to address in the session is understanding the financing process from an operational perspective, and that has many prongs to it. Getting the money, working with the bank, when you've got the money, working out how you're going to use that, where are those funds going to be applied. Part of the process is actually knowing you can pay the money back when you've got it, continuing to stay on track, actually paying it back, and that really is the process of sort of maintaining operational finance, getting it, making it, paying it back, and monitoring how you're going. Then part of this process also is looking at some shared experiences. I'll give you some experiences that I've had with clubs that have done things well, and the better stories, the more interesting stories, are the ones that have done things not so well, because they're quite incredulous. People say that couldn't possibly happen, and they do provide some learning. But obviously, with some clubs, certainly when you've got them, when I have them as a client, I can't provide a lot of the details because it's subject to confidentiality commitments to a client. But where I've been the liquidator of a club, I am the client, so I'm quite happy to share those experiences with you. And I guess that comes to really a little bit about me. I come to this role wearing two hats. That's why I've got no hair. If you wear two hats, it will fall out. Sorry, Jamil.
3 hats.
So one is as a consultant to the good end of the industry, and that would comprise most of the clubs that are in this room. Clubs that are successful, that are innovative, that are investing, and then to the other end of the industry where clubs are struggling and really having trouble staying alive. So that spectrum of experience gives me, I guess, some insight into to enable me to share some of that with you. But prior to being involved with the club industry, I had 17 years as a straight-out insolvency practitioner. And if you want to find something that is like going to work and putting your head in a meat grinder, try doing that. So the club industry and hospitality beyond that is a much more enjoyable experience, but the education that I got from my 17 years working in a meat grinder have added some value to, I think, what I can provide as an advisor to the industry. And I guess one other aspect is sharing the uniqueness of this industry. It is a really unusual industry. And I don't know if you've ever really sat back and had to think about it, but we have a product which is a machine. It's a machine that people will walk up to with a pile of cash in their pocket. They'll put it into that machine. There's no more input required from you. You provide the machine, provide the chair, they bring the cash, it goes through that machine, and then over a period of time you get to keep about 10% of it. That is a really unusual business model. And if you think about it, that is at the core of our industry. That the opportunity to have such a machine it's almost like it's out of a cartoon. It's having a room full of machines, you walk up, people put money in, and they sit there and press buttons, and you get to keep 10% of it. That's a very unusual, but it's also a very privileged business model to have, and I guess that's the point I'm really trying to make about it. Having gaming machines comes as a privilege, and it's a privilege that is generated, or it is generated because Clubs Foundation was supporting the community. So the government of the day gave gaming to clubs as a means by which they could support a particular endeavour. Not necessarily as a means by which they can make things cheap, like beer and food. They were primarily given as a means by which the club could support sport or some other endeavour. And somewhere along the way, there's been a slight twist in the purpose, because some of our members think we're here to make things cheap all the time. And that's an education process that I guess is ongoing forever. But the uniqueness of our industry, founded on gaming, was really that we were given these machines that people put money into. We just keep 10% of it. And the object of was, for that 10% that we got to keep, to spend that on our objects, on our sporting endeavours, on promoting whatever it is that our club was formed for. And obviously our industry is often in the press, so I don't know if anyone gets that news service from Clubs New South Wales, the media report. I happened to find an article that I can't quite remember seeing in there, but I'll put it up and just have a read and tell me if you remember it. Everyone read that so far? Everyone done with that? Well, that's the icebreaker for an accounting session. So, I don't know if you happen to see that one in the news reports, but it's from the Tudor Advocate. And if you want to know where the Tudor is, it's somewhere in Queensland. I've got another story at the end of the presentation just to make sure you stay awake right through. So really, I guess we've got through some of this already. What is the relevance of operational finance in a club? To ensure there is enough free cash to support the repayment of debt and the investment in other facilities or new opportunities. Where does the cash flow come from? And the brackets work, where does the cash come from a bank? Where does the cash flow come from? Usually from a poker machine or, as we now know it, a British laptop. Has anyone ever heard that term before for a poker machine? No. You have? Yeah. I thought it was a good name. So we'll skip over that. Oh, there was a corollary there.
Obviously a man of principle. Work with a fire?
So when you think about the process and borrowing money from a bank, and I know there's some here that haven't had to do that, there's some that may have to do it shortly, but borrowing money from a bank starts the need for operational finance. But from a typical perspective, most clubs don't need working capital finance because we've got these machines that we keep 10% of the cash that goes in. So the day-to-day operations of the business are usually funded from the normal trading cycle. And if a club can't fund its normal trading cycle from its normal cash flows, then it really must have very big problems. But the process that I'm focusing on now is when a club's looking at financing its next step, which may be acquisitions of other assets or investment in new opportunities, understanding how the process works, I guess, is part of managing operational finance. Because if you think about a building project as an example, you spend some time in the planning, and it can be years. You might spend 12 months in the planning. You'll certainly spend 12 months in the approval process, depending on which council you're dealing with or the scale of the project. But quite often what's forgotten is that there is a process in dealing with the bank. And the bank can sometimes be a more long-winded exercise than you would expect. The way it normally works, bank manager is the salesman, the foot soldier, out selling the wares of the bank, and he'll find a relationship with the club, or the club will find him, whichever way it goes, or her. The deal's discussed, the bank manager discusses with his original or direct superior, and prepares a basic proposal. When there's enough detail provided, it goes through to a credit analyst inside the bank who says whether or not the deal can be done. And that process, I guess, is the first litmus test in the relationship, because when the relationship manager comes to the client, when they're talking about this project that they're about to start building in potentially, oh yeah, fine, no problem, yeah, we'll have it, we'll turn it around very quickly. And I've seen this circumstance a number of times where the relationship guy says, yes, not a problem, we'll do it, very quick, a couple of weeks, all sorted. But when it gets to the credit analyst, that's when the real truth comes out. There's a whole approval cycle to go through, and it's going to take probably 3 months at best to go from beginning to end of that credit approval cycle. So if you've signed a building contract and you've commenced construction, and by the time you get your credit approval through, it works through from the analyst, back up the line into the credit department, term sheets are issued, legal documents are issued, contracts are issued, they're reviewed potentially by your lawyers, and then eventually signed. You might be at 3 and possibly even 4 or 5 months down the track. And if you've left the bank approval process to too late, and you've committed to a construction contract that has a start date and all sorts of ugly time penalties around it, then you're wanting to make sure that these things start on time, the project starts on time, and that you're able to pay the builder when they're due for payment. So not allowing the proper process or the proper time for bank approval is, I guess, the first consideration. And I'd hope that most of you in this room are reasonably organised on that. I have seen circumstances where people have relied on commitments from a relationship manager. Yep, it'll be fine, won't be a problem. And 3 months later, they're struggling for cash flow because they've had to use absolute every bit of cash they've had in the business to meet the first construction progress payment to keep the builder on track and confident. So definitely the message here is give enough time in the approval process to make sure that you don't have a glitch in your operating cash flows, because if you've got to start diverting operating cash flows out of the business into paying a builder, then that can be a big problem in the business. And I could probably give you half a dozen experiences over probably the last decade where clubs have done that, relied on a quick turnaround from a bank, thought they had an existing relationship, thought they'll be fine, and then get caught out at the last minute. So in your project planning timeline, I'd certainly slate four months out from project commencement, at least 4 months out from project commencement. Make sure you've got your funding approval in place. Don't leave it till 3 or 2 months, because if there's some glitch, and I'll give you an example of a glitch, you might find when the bank goes to do a search on the club's records with ASIC or with Land Titles Office, that there's an old mortgage. And I've seen a circumstance where there's an old mortgage to the Bank of New South Wales that's still registered on title. I don't know if any of you know, but the Bank of New South Wales hasn't been around for 30 years or so, or 20 years.
At least.
But they've got a mortgage that's registered on the club's title. And the new bank's not going to take a security position without that old mortgage being released. Well, do you think that's going to happen overnight? So all these little things that are completely unexpected can come out of left field. So having done the work before you start the project is critical. Once you've got the bank in tow and you've managed to get the documents all signed in time, then you've got to work with the bank. And banks get lampooned for their harsh attitudes quite often. Although I'll have to say that my experience in dealing with them when clubs are in difficulty has actually been pretty good. But there's a reason that they behave the way they do, and that is because they are a business accountable to shareholders, but they're also accountable to somebody else, which is APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority. And that sets the guidelines for how the bank has to operate. And that process has become much more rigorous over the last few years. Post-GFC, controls have been tightened. The balances that the bank has to retain in reserve in the event of an account being irregular have increased. So they're very, very conscious of the club's capacity to pay when they lend money, and also throughout the term of the loan. If a loan falls out of parameters, then it has significant consequences for the bank from a profit point of view. I guess the other thing to realise is that when you look at banks, each of those branches are accountable as a profit centre as well. So if their cost of funds is increasing because the performance of a club or a client has changed, then the client is going to wear the cost of that increased cost of operating. And a lot of that comes from APRA. So they're very conscious of looking at debt servicing capacity. They look at industry concentrations. You see phases where banks come in and out of an industry. At the moment, we're in flavour again. ANZ, and I think pretty well most of them are very happy to be lending to the club industry at the moment. But we could be 2 years down the track and they've assessed their exposure to a sector and they've said, well, we've got to stop. We're overexposed in that sector. And they start to wind back. So understanding those sorts of things and what drives them can give you some insight into how they might behave. And I'll give you an example of this is a case that's actually in play at the moment. And I won't give you too much information because I don't want you to work out where it is. This is a club that is undertaking, well, now has completed renovations, built an entirely new business, and they also renovated the club at the time of doing it. They were overreaching. I'd done some numbers for them and said, look, you're actually projecting too much revenue growth, your figures are optimistic, you're borrowing too much money. And I had a meeting with their bank manager, who was the sales agent at that point. No, look, we've got to cut this project back. And the bank manager threw me under a bus and said, you've got to spend money to make money, quote. That's what he said in front of the client. So this relationship manager was anxiously sending money out the door. Must have been bonus time for him. And anyway, they overborrowed. They borrowed too much money, against my advice. And what do you know? We're a year down the track. The file's now in review. It's been re-rated. It's gone from a B to a C. It's one step off going to D. It will come back. It's heading the right way now. But the consequence of that change meant their cost of interest went up because they couldn't meet the performance requirements that were in the bank covenants. And all this was actually highlighted in front of the bank manager. They won't meet the covenants, and the client for that matter. So there's two guilty parties in this equation. There's no point having a dog if you're not going to let him bark. So they were given the advice that they were overreaching, overextending. They still chose to do it because they said, oh, it's cheaper to do the whole thing now than to come back in stages. Well, it is cheaper if you survive, but if you don't survive, then all is lost. They are working their way through it, but that was an example where the sales part of the bank was driving an outcome. The other thing that triggered in that story was that they were outside the bank's covenants for interest cover, which we'll talk about in a little while. And once you go outside the covenants or breach a covenant, there's two main consequences. One is the cost of funds goes up. The second is that your balance sheet has a fundamental change occurring out of your choice, where your total liability to the bank becomes classified as a current liability. And then that has another consequence, which then says, is the club a going concern with this large current liability? So that example is actually working through. The next stage is that they're about to sign their annual report for this year, and will require a letter of comfort from the bank so that the auditor will be satisfied with the going concern basis for the accounts. Why did all this happen? Because they over-borrowed. They didn't listen to the advice that they were given. So that is a true story, and it's a club that is in a regional area, in a very tough market. It will survive, but it could have survived a whole lot easier with a whole lot less pain and a whole lot less stress for the manager if they'd have just cut their project back by about $800,000 instead of spending what they spent. So you think it's all easy, and if the bank manager's saying it's all okay, well, it must be okay. But remember where the bank manager sits in that scale of approval. He's the sales guy. That guy's now getting his backside kicked from here to head office because of the way he handled the account. Anyway.
In a situation like that, and that's that club goes to the wall, how does the bank come out? Do they come out winners?
Well, they've got security. Taking the bank on when you've got no resources to take them on will be difficult. In that particular place, if you sold the club, the bank wouldn't get paid.
So, Greg, where did the board sit with all this decision making?
Well, there's another part to the story. I just need to be careful because I don't want anyone to know who I'm talking about. Yeah, well, I might shut up then. Look, the board were out of play in this. The board were not understanding what was going on, and the bank manager actually took advantage of that and had a meeting with the board directly when he knew that they didn't really have a picture of what was going on. The manager wasn't present in this meeting, got the board to sign these loan documents.
Is that an excuse, Greg? Not knowing is not an excuse, sure.
No, it's not an excuse. It's not an excuse. It won't wash. But still, there's a commitment made which was immediately breached. So it'll work its way through. It is working its way through, but a whole lot of angst for a whole lot of people. And the reason the manager, and this is a little bit about how banks work, the reason the manager did that was because he was outside of his guidelines in dealing with the loan. So it was almost a self-protection mechanism for the manager to get this facilities agreement signed, which then put the club in a continuing difficult position.
Hey, Greg, when you move from the current liabilities because of the breach of covenant, if you've got half a dozen covenants on your loan agreement, how many of those covenants do you have to breach before that happens?
One.
Just one.
Depends on the bank. The bank.
bank.
It could be anything. If the bank, but the bank might just say no. It's been waived.
It's a very discretion.
Yeah.
How strong is this APRA anyway? Because lately some banks have been getting away with murder.
I can't answer how strong they are. I mean, I guess their only sanction is to take away a banking licence or impose a penalty. But I guess you could answer that question another way. How strong is ASIC? How strong is all these other government authorities that are supposed to regulate? They don't seem to do too much.
Greg, just one question. You said the guy selling to the bank manager, why didn't their integrity pick it up?
It has. This is still in play. No, it's been picked up now.
No, but I mean, like he's selling it here, he's got to take it to his people.
They had a 3-month window. There was a 3-month window.
They lent the money before
Yeah. And they had a window within which...
What I was saying, why did the bank pick it up? He's over...
It did pick it up. It did pick it up, but it had to...
They didn't take the advice of
No.
the bank.
No, the bank. Well, the advice wasn't given to the bank, the advice was given to the club. And the bank was, the words were, you've got to spend money to make money. That's what the manager said.
That's easy, but
Yeah.
he's got to go through his,
Yeah.
get the loan passed.
Yeah.
So why would it picked up there?
I can't answer the question. I don't
Well,
know.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. You would expect it would be.
Before I say we're like this,
Yeah.
they should have.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's all timing. In that case, it was timing because the previous set of accounts were much more positive than the current set, which is what I was using to say stop.
But as you said, no one took your advice, the bank or them, or you didn't with the bank.
I wasn't advising the bank.
They would have,
Yeah.
they would have had to say, well, we've had this advice.
Yeah, but the bank had information that was probably 9 months old. The information I was using was current.
They wouldn't have mentioned your advice.
No, they wouldn't have mentioned my advice. Right. Sort of. Not a full-time, separate engaged one. So when you get to this position, right, we'll move on. You look at what does the bank offer, and I want to try and make this a positive session, not all what can go bad. And you've got all these different financing products. The first three are general security type lending, where you've got a facility that's paid down over time, a lump of money for a general purpose is lent, or development, or a refurbishment, or an acquisition. And then you've got these asset finance type agreements, which are these ones down here. And what I've seen sometimes happen is that a club will get to its limit with its normal trading bank on its commercial loan facility, and then it'll go and see a broker, a finance broker, and try and get separate asset finance, which is outside of the core security of the bank. And these are all shorter term type agreements, 3, possibly 4 years. And the money's easier to get because it's from sometimes from a non-bank lending institution, or from another bank or a finance company.
It's usually higher interest.
And it's definitely higher interest, and it's a shorter term for repayment, but the approval process is often much easier. And so you'll find a club that gets its limit achieved here, can't go any further, it gets all these other asset finance agreements which just make a bigger problem in cash flow. And then the securities that we've got vary. General security agreement, I'm not sure if you know what that term is, but it's replaced what used to be called a fixed and floating charge. There's a whole new regime for securities in play in Australia now. The real property mortgage, and also this other thing, this PPSR registration, Personal Property Security Register, which is a register of interests in assets other than land. And its whole focus was to try and make things easier in terms of the priority of debt and the priority of securities. I'm not sure that it's done that. It's like a new simplified tax act, not much more simple than it was before. But that's the place where most of these things were registered. And if you have a search of your own company file, your own club file, you'll find probably 15 or 20 PBSR registrations that you may know nothing about. And you'll have probably one from Lion, one from Carlton, maybe one from Coca-Cola. Your normal trade suppliers will have agreements registered on that register against your club's credit file with the PPSR. And that's, hey? Oh, you can just do a search. And the reason they do that is because they supply stock to you on credit, and they're entitled to that registration with or without your approval. So, has anyone heard of that scheme before?
Oh, we used to have to register all our stuff in the building trade under that, so if you got caught on a thing that went belly up,
Yeah.
you could go and get your property tax.
Yeah.
So jackhammers or bloody things like that,
Yeah.
trucks. If it was on property, you could get it back.
Yeah, well this is fairly new, it's probably 3 or 4 years in operation now. So just be aware of it in the background. It's not necessarily related to working capital or operating finance, but it's just a piece of information that you might find useful or you might find completely irrelevant.
That financial leasing agreement, purchase of things like, say, parking machines, what's your view on that?
Oh, look, it can have a place. It's just it all comes down to your cash flow. I mean, the cash flow forecast is critical. And some of those facilities are rolling facilities, so it's almost a different form of debt, of secured debt. So they just roll in at a value. So you might have a $2 million asset finance facility, which is just come and go. So you just continue to pay it, and as the balance reduces, you can draw against it further. They're okay, but you've got to fit them into your cash flow. The example I was giving was where a club might be extending or refurbishing. They get to the limit of what the bank's prepared to lend them, then they say, well, we need to go and get the chairs, we need the new fridges, we need some new ovens, and they go and lease all that stuff because they can't get it within their facility. And then they open with an awful cash flow. There's no money left. So the nature of club assets is from a banking point of view, is important. Land and buildings are certainly desired as a primary security. Freehold or leasehold classification for these things. So if you've got leased buildings or a leased club building on leased land, I'll rephrase that. If you have a building that you have built on leased land, then it has virtually no security value. So that's a banker's perspective. Plant and equipment has value. Intangibles, gaming entitlements now have value, which are lent against. And depending on the nature of the asset, depending on its zoning, can have a major impact. Land, even if freehold, can have limited value, and you really do need to have a look at zoning when you want to determine what the value of your security is, because your accounts will reflect a value, but what it's really worth can be something entirely different. I don't know if anyone remember Demon Sports Club?
Yeah.
Right, well, Demon Sports Club had its land and buildings, and I'll talk about it because I was the liquidator of it, so I'm not breaching any confidences. It had its land and buildings in its book at $7 million. What were they really worth?
Was leased land.
No, part of it was leased. But what were they really worth? On an open market basis, just over $2 million. Why? Because of the zoning. It was open space and it was flood affected. I don't know if any of you remember, but to get inside that club, you had to walk over the moat. So there was a hill around it, so you'd climb up and then go into the club because it was basically on a very low floodplain. So it was worth very little as an asset. So understanding the security value is part of understanding operating finance, how far you can go with your property as a security. Its specialised nature also limits its value from lending purposes. But there's a good side to this. If you think about clubs that are certainly in metropolitan areas now and happen to be on a transport corridor, with all of the height limit changes pardon me, along railway lines, there's some winning lottery tickets sitting in club properties where the value of the land has just gone up phenomenally. So, and that will provide opportunity for clubs into the future, using that security value carefully to do something that takes them into the next mode of business. Just need to watch the time. So when you boil it all down, the issue that I guess sits behind any finance issue, whether it is borrowing the money or paying it back, is cash flow. How you can demonstrate debt serviceability is based on your existing cash flows. How you can demonstrate the ability to pay it back in the future is based on your forecast cash flows. What your forecast cash flows include may include an element of growth or blue sky. The degree of reliance on that blue sky will determine the level of confidence that the bank has in approving a loan. When you look at the end game of solvency, paying your debts as and when they fall due, it's all about cash flow. It's not about an asset test, it's about cash flow. That's why so often when clubs fail, everyone ends up getting paid, because if they're on a decent property, then the realisation of the property pays the creditors back. If they're not on a property that's zoned appropriately, or if they're on leasehold property, you'll see situations where the creditors don't get paid. And the other thing about cash flow is it is generally something that is fundamental in bank covenants. They'll have ratios or limits that are based on you achieving a certain level of interest coverage, which is all based around cash flow. And in the club industry, we've really, I guess, to some extent simplified how we deal with cash flow, which has all these consequences in terms of covenants. And we've put a big focus on EBITDA, which I'll talk about in a moment. But just before I do, just another example of a club where they lost their focus, and it's another one that's it's currently playing out at the moment. This is a club that has probably struggled for 10 years, and it's still in process at the moment, and hopefully we'll come through it. But Cessnock Workers Club, well, sorry, Cessnock Ex-Services Club, get the name right, don't want to be sued by someone. And it's a club that had borrowed money for a refurbishment 10 years ago. That was the last money that was spent on the club. About 10 years ago, it also amalgamated with another club, which is Curry Workers Club, an amalgamation that should never have occurred. But it did occur. After that renovation that they had 10 years ago that didn't really work, and after the amalgamation they had that shouldn't have happened, they had really no cash flow. So for the last 10 years there's been nothing spent on that club. Their EBITDA for the last 3 years has been well below 10, and in one of those 3 years was negative. So that meant that every day that they were open they were just sending cash out the door. Got to the point where the bank was in the asset management part of the bank. The bank was sitting back, very involved with what was going on. But the other thing that was happening was that the auditor was issuing these opinions, and the members were getting, some of them were getting more agitated, and one of them made a complaint to ILGA, or Liquor and Gaming. And that complaint prompted an investigation by Liquor and Gaming, and the auditor's opinion, which was adverse. So an adverse opinion is different to a qualified opinion. Qualified, matter of emphasis, issue is relatively straightforward, but an adverse opinion...
We changed the
that adverse opinion is one that says the basis of accounting is no longer valid. They were using a going concern basis to account, and the auditor was saying it's no longer a going concern, you should not be using going concern. Well, that sent all the lights red in at Liquor and Gaming, so they started an investigation, and they basically pushed it to the point and said, if you don't appoint an administrator under the Corporations Act, we'll appoint an administrator under the Registered Clubs Act. And that's an example of a club, two wrong decisions, not tracking EBITDA, not tracking cash flow, ignored all the advice that they could have. And you know, the clubs in this room would say that wouldn't happen. And for the clubs in this room, it wouldn't happen. But it still does happen in the industry, and that one's working its way through at the moment. So we'll see where it ends up. Hopefully Cessnock Ex-Services Club will make it through as a venue. But the other point in that story was that the regulator's observation of what goes on is better than you think. I mean, they were watching that They were aware of the adverse opinion, and they got to the point and said, if you as a group of directors don't do something, we will. In fact, they did. They made the appointment, which was to appoint a person as administrator under the Registered Clubs Act if they didn't make the appointment under the Corps Act.
So technically, they were trading insolvent?
Definitely.
So absolutely.
It is.
How does that sit with the Curry amalgamation?
It happened 10 years ago.
So they still started.
The Curry's closed. Curry actually sold. It settles today. So that's another one gone. So back to EBITDA, and I know you've had this is hopefully now boring. You should be able to close your eyes and quote every one of those numbers to me. But it is important because it sits behind so much of the basics of business. If you don't have a cash flow, you haven't got a business. And if you can't maintain the cash flow, you won't hold on to that business. And these indicators, these aren't prescribed in any piece of law. These are indicators that come from experience, from more than just my experience, from a whole lot of people's experience that say, well, if you can't hold more than 10 cents in the dollar out of every dollar you have in revenue, you're heading for disaster. And remember, we've got these machines that you walk up to and people put cash in them and you get to keep 10%. That's pretty easy money, pretty cheap to get. You've just got to get the number of people there. Don't. Yeah, I know, but it's as an efficient form of profit. It's a very efficient form of profit compared to making widgets, or better still, compared to baking cakes or serving food. There's much easier money in gaming. But my point is, these EBITDA ranges are good indicators of financial health and good indicators to really just keep in the back of your mind when you're watching performance. And certainly, we've just done a planning meeting for a club up the coast, and their EBITDA historically has been at around 18%. They've got a big focus on sport, and they've actually in their strategic plan they've set a target that says if our EBITDA falls to 15% for 2 consecutive quarters, that will prompt a full operational review of the club to work out why it's dropped and what we can do to bring it back up. That's in their strategic plan as a safety net in case things drop off. And you can get away with 1 quarter, explain it away, but if it happens for 2 in a row, now we've got to do something positive about it. And to be realistic, most of the industry is operating here. When I say most of the industry is small clubs, not typical of the clubs generally in this room, but the majority of the industry is going to be sitting there. I'd say a lot of the clubs sitting in this room are probably sitting here, and a few of them are sitting here. There might be one sitting here. Yeah. So there's a couple sitting there, but the majority are sitting just down here. And
that's a pretty flexible. If you take catering away, you can change that every hour.
you can, but it's surprising. It depends on the size of the business. I looked at that in a medium-sized club, took catering out of their numbers to see what it did to their EBITDA. It moved it by 0.5%. Well, or the proportion of catering to the rest of the business was insignificant. Well, probably, actually, what it probably does tell you, their gaming business was very large. Yep. So if you've got a much smaller gaming revenue, yes, that can make that change. In fact, I saw a club do it, where they outsourced catering thinking that was going to be the solution to their problem because it would move their EBITDA up, but what they didn't realise was there was a fundamental problem in the size of the business. So you can have a 25% EBITDA and $100,000 in revenue, and you say, well, if I look at that indicator, we're fine, everything's good. But you can't survive on $100,000 in business. You need a 25% EBITDA on $10 million in revenue, and then you've got enough cash to do it. So if the revenue base is too small, it doesn't matter what your EBITDA is. So you've got to consider the two. What is the right revenue base and what is the right EBITDA? There are alternatives to banks. I mean, banks will look at cash flow as the primary determinant in lending money. There are others that will look at assets. But apart from the four major trading banks, there are a whole stack of banks in Australia. This is the list of them. There's pages of them. Some of them are credit unions, but there's a lot of foreign banks here. There's about 120 banks in Australia. Oh, it didn't come up. It's on my screen. Okay. So this is the list of banks in Australia. There's a lot of them there. When you talk about banks in Australia, most of you will only name 4 or 5 names. Sorry, they're credit unions, but you've got all these banks: State Bank, NAB, PNN Bank, Police Bank, Kudos Bank, St George, Suncorp, Victoria Teachers Mutual Bank. That's one group, and then you've got all these others, which are credit unions, and we also have foreign banks here, and branches of foreign banks, all operating in Australia. Most of them won't lend to the club industry, but I've just given you that just to show you that there are more than just the 4. And let's see if this works again.
When you borrow overseas banks, you borrow in euros and pounds.
Most of them will want to lend to you in their currency.
Yeah.
But I think there's been a few lessons in that one. Yeah.
It can be good sometimes.
It can be good and it can be horrendous. I think there's those foreign currency loans from the late 80s had some horror stories attached to them where our exchange rate went through the floor and the interest payments and capital payments went through the roof. I mean, from a club point of view, I think it'd be pretty adventurous to be borrowing in foreign currency. So, from a lending point of view, back to the facts of Australian banks will be looking at cash flow when lending to a club. Even though there's a whole lot of other banks here, most of them won't lend to the club industry. If you can't get money from a bank or some other typical source, there are other parties that are providing or trying to provide funds to clubs. These interested, I call them interested joint venture partners, that will come to a club and say, we will do this deal for you, we will fund the DA, we will fund the development, we just need you to make this portion of the property available to us as security. And again, that is a difficult path to tread, because if you can't borrow money from a bank, that means you haven't got a cash flow that supports borrowing money from a bank, which probably means you haven't got a cash flow to support the costs of getting good and independent advice. And what they often end up doing is relying on this good group of people, these good blokes who have walked through the door and are going to help them out. And it normally ends in more than tears. So hopefully there's none of you in this room that are in that category, but if you are dealing with a joint venture partner, and I don't want to make the statement to say that they're all not reputable, that would be a foolhardy thing to say, but you need to have your eyes opened and make sure you've gone through a proper process, made proper inquiries, but above all, have at least enough cash flow to get proper and independent advice. And if these people are truly what they say they are, and you have no cash flow, they should make the money available to you to go and get proper and independent advice if they're as honourable as they suggest they might be. Because if you don't, you will be the ones that suffer the consequences. I'll go through that a little bit more in a minute. But when you're looking at how you deal with opportunities, how you deal with investment and non-core property or property that can be developed, the thing that I try and stress with clubs is that the first thing to prioritise is the core business. If you can't get your core business right and producing a reasonable cash flow, relying on a development to give you a solution to that problem won't get you there. To get through a development process in the ordinary sense takes years. It takes resources to fund advice, it takes resources to pay for architects, it takes money. To get an approval up and running on any significant project, you're probably talking $500,000 in consulting fees at least. And that's not just lawyers and accountants, that's architects and designers and engineers and town planners, and the list goes on. But if you have a strategy that says you want to diversify, then there should be a little line in front of that when the core business is in shape to support diversification. And looking around the room, I'd say most of the clubs here have a core business that is able to support diversification. And I know some of you are following down that path. Ignore gaming at your peril. Regardless of what the world might be doing and how the internet might be impacting on revenues generally, gaming is still fundamental to our business. So don't direct your investment away from gaming to invest in some other less fundamental profit source. Sometimes clubs do a development, they've got nothing left to invest in their gaming installation, they spend nothing on gaming for 2 or 3 years, and what do you know? Gaming revenue just goes like that. Has anyone ever done that? Sort of pulled back on gaming, if they want to admit to it, and to try and fund something else? It happens remarkably a lot of times. So you just can't do it. Whatever your capital investment plans are, you must provide for enough cash flow to go back into gaming. Diversification comes a definite second. And when you look at what most revenues are that come from diversification, none of them will produce a cash flow that's anything like a gaming cash flow. You can have the very best and the latest and all the food outlets we can put up on all the notice boards and say what a great and novel idea. But when you look at the profit that it produces, it will never replace a gaming cash flow. What it will do is bring people to the venue to use your gaming machines, but it won't replace the cash flow. So as a means of getting people to the venue, yes, if you call that diversification, having a broader range of food options, that's a good choice, but it won't give you the profit. You need to have a strategic direction, a plan that guides these changes and filters the choices between core business and other choices. Cash flow and capital planning is absolutely required. Knowing what you can afford, when you can afford it, how much you can invest at different points in time. You need that view at least 5 years down the track if you're looking at some sort of significant project, preferably 7. People will say, how can you possibly do a forecast out 7 years? Well, you take the current business and apply a number of reasonable changes to it and say this is what it should look like, all things being equal. Is it a crystal ball? No, it's not. Is it a tool for making a decision? Yes, it is. But it's definitely not a crystal ball. But if you said, how do I justify a decision as being reasonable? Thanks, Jamil. I'm right, thanks. Okay. He's in the hospitality industry. Thank you. Thanks. How do you justify a decision as being reasonable? Well, you've had a look. You've applied reasonable judgment. It's not a crystal ball, but it's the best you can do in the circumstances. So you tick that box. Does it guarantee success? No, it doesn't. Does it guarantee you can defend yourself? More than likely it does. Yes, that's right. So in terms of looking down the track and monitoring the process, remember the things I said we were going to talk about, getting the money, making the money, monitoring it. You've got to really look at how you get information day to day, week to week, what you see as being relevant for you to stay informed as to what the business is doing. Now, there's no one size fits all for this. If I put a question to you, how many people wear size 12 shoes here? 11? 10? So on, so on, so on. Everyone's got a different size shoe. So, what I say is that the information that you use, you will all use differently. Not necessarily according to shoe size, but you will use it differently. So what works for me or what works for Terry may not work for someone else in the room. You've got to look at how you get your information and make sure it's relevant to you and gives you enough information to make a decision, to understand where you sit with the bank, and also to make sure you're driving the performance of the club. Now, I've got quite a few slides here to go through, but before I go into the slides on different indicators, that is a set of key indicators that summarise the main things that you would track in a business across a year. Now, you look at that page and you say, well, that's a whole lot of numbers, it means nothing to me. And if you look at it closely, you might see something in it. Well, let's look at gaming. Well, this is a club where they're gaming net per machine per day. Does everyone use that language? And again, so that's another variable. Some talk net per month, some talk net per day, some call it something slightly different. What do they call it? There's another different acronym for net per machine per day. But you can see this club, it's hovering around that 150 to 160 mark, and you look at what's relevant from a director's point of view. How's our gaming going? Well, we're tracking at our expected daily net. Here's what our monthly revenues are. We're holding retention, that very difficult subject of retention that we heard Justine Channing talk about, the difference in product and what that's doing to retention. That's what that looks like across this particular year. What's our wages percentage in gaming? So all those indicators are there. Same thing's repeated in food, gross margin in food. And they are the critical things that make business work. Holding your margin, holding your wage percentage in a club, holding onto your gaming revenue and your net per machine per day. Same applies for beverage, all straightforward and simple numbers. So from a director's point of view, given that you're involved in overviewing the performance, you could say that there's almost enough information, there's a little bit more to that page, there's almost enough information on that page. I'll just see if we can scroll down a bit. There's almost enough information on that page for you to have a snapshot of the business. So the next bits that were there, we had food, we had gaming, beverage, food, beverage, reporting gross margin and wages percentages. Overall, what the profit was, what the EBITDA was for the month, what the EBITDA ratio was, EBITDA expressed as a percentage of revenue. There's a page and a half or 2 pages so far just dealing with operational numbers. Here's your balance sheet that deals with banking covenants, what the bank debt is over the period that you're reporting on. And this is a sheet that would build month by month as you went through the year, what your interest expense is, and there are these ratios called interest cover, which is how many times you pay your interest bill out of EBITDA. The bank will have a covenant, so there you've written across the year what the covenant is for the year, And the interest coverage covenant would be to maintain an interest coverage ratio of not less than 3 times. So you can see in this example, it's always above. You're paying principal off every month. There's a principal and interest coverage ratio, which is how many times you pay your principal and interest off out of EBITDA. And there's also a covenant, which is 1.5 times coverage. And in all those cases, it was above. Now, you can present that as pages of numbers. You've got to do a little bit of work to understand it. And you'd probably pick this one out and say, gee whiz, they got a bit close in that month. Well, remember it's only a month in 12, but you might say, well, if you saw that number, you'd say, well, gee whiz, what happened in that particular month to bring our coverage ratio so close to our covenant? And as directors, that's the sort of question you might ask. And you can see, well, in June, our net per machine per day was well down for some reason. It was down, well, that quarter looks like it was down, but June was the low point. So for some reason, gaming dropped away, and that had a knock-on impact. Now, that's a way to present indicators, and you might say, well, it doesn't work for me. And you're entitled to do that. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not even suggesting you should use it. I'm just showing it to you. Because there's another way that you might find a little bit more useful. So using graphs, this is the same information presented graphically, or part of it, and how you chop it up and cut it up. And I know Harry's got plenty of tools in this sort of department that he would use. We made a comment about EBIT, about June's result being down. Well, here we've got a graph of gaming performance, and we can see 2 lines. Retention was way down in June, but so was net per machine per day. Well, they go hand in hand, so if retention was down, you would expect net per machine per day to be down.
In a situation like that where it's good before and good after, that month would be just put down as weather, can't it?
Well, it just could be, it's a retention. It could be the weather, but it could just be that cycle of retention that sort of goes up and down when you win months, some months.
Look at it as a quarter group rather than a monthly basis.
Yeah. Well, you could look at it over the quarter, but I mean, obviously, my perspective is that monthly is the appropriate time frame, but you can see the trend over the quarter. Yeah. Yeah, but that's probably, you can almost see like a wave through there, this retention up and down, and you'll see that in your own results where your retention sort of doing these ones. You might do a bit more of that, but
You do it monthly, and you do June this month against June last month.
Yeah.
Last year.
yeah.
Rather than,
Yeah, it's a matter of what works for you. So you can put a budget up there, you can put this year against last year, you can put the trend over the year. It's really whatever helps you make a decision. But, Harry?
It's worth putting a marker in from year to date.
Yep, and there's a million ways to do it. But the point is, we're all here of different shoe sizes. In a boardroom, there are 9 different shoe sizes in the room, probably more. Some people have 2 left feet. But you've got other staff in there. So you might have 10 or 11 people sitting around a table digesting information. It's worth agreeing on what a reporting format is. What works? What shows you what you need to know? So if you put information on a graph, okay, it's on the graph. It takes a little bit of work, not a lot of work, but sometimes it takes a little bit of work to get it onto the graph. What do you do with it once it's there? What decision can you make from that? What question can you ask? If it leads you nowhere, it's probably not worth putting on the graph. But if it takes you somewhere, if it leads to a question or an inquiry about what trend is emerging in the business, then it probably is worth having on the graph. Now, I've got a whole series of these, and I could have put all sorts of detail up there to give examples of it. So just run through these ones. But remember, this is, or don't remember, this is all made out of a report in Excel. And you've heard what they said about Moore's law with data processing. If you want to make a chart in Excel now, you basically just hold your mouse over it and say insert chart, it's all done for you. There's virtually no skill required. My kids would make more complicated Excel charts than I could ever make. And that's because, well, they do it all the time at school now, but they've just got that skill. It's not that hard. So there's no excuse for not having the reporting that works for you. And in terms of maintaining operational finance, fundamental. So you need to have a look at what you're getting and make sure it works. And I'm not, for the secretary managers in the world, I'm not trying to turn the world upside down in terms of how information's prepared, but it's really a lot easier to put information into a form that people can understand than try and work through pages and pages and pages of lines that people don't understand. And I'll give you an example of how that doesn't work well, because when people don't understand something, and this is human nature, they're not going to stick their hand up generally and say, I don't understand it. Some will, but most won't. What they will generally do is default to their safe position, which is to ask a question about something they know they can understand. I've got a club client at the moment where they present all their financial information, and there's two directors who then go through the credit card statement in the board meeting, line by line by line by line by line by line. What is that for? Where did you buy that from? Why did you spend that much on it in a board meeting? Why do they do that? Because they don't understand the rest of it. That's the only way, in their mind, they can demonstrate some contribution. So it's a two-edged sword. If you don't give it, then people will default to a position which shows them in a position of some knowledge. Where do they go to? What they can understand. I understand a credit card statement, I'll ask questions there. Get this, no questions, or maybe a page full of other numbers, maybe hopefully not this, no questions asked because they don't understand it. So it really is quite important for two reasons. One is the information should be there, but it makes the board meeting work better. It makes people able to contribute if you can get the formats right so they understand what's there. Same sort of thing, gaming KPIs. So this is showing gaming net per machine per day in the green coloured histogram, and then the carded percentage, what the machines are theoretically carded at in this installation, which was 8.15%. And then the retention percentage that's been achieved over the year. So there's that cycle again. It's the same data. Different ways of presenting it. Again, it's a matter of what works for you, what helps you make a decision, what gives information. So the thing that's been added there is this carded percentage. So people say, well, okay, we've won this month, we're in front, we're ahead of our carded percentage. Well, what does that probably mean? Well, there's a get square coming. So if you're sitting in April, you've only got this information in front of you. This hasn't yet arrived because it hasn't happened. So you're sitting in April and you can see you're above the blue line up to there. The CEO or the gaming manager is probably saying, get ready, it's coming, it's going to drop off. And there you go, it drops off. The retention falls away and comes back to normal. So you know, if you're wanting some confidence about how the business is going, maybe that works for some. And throwing a wages percentage on to see what's happening in the business in terms of how efficiently the venue's being run. So this is all about gaming. And these dotted lines are trend lines. So if you can't work out what the trend is by looking at the graphs, well, you can actually get Excel to throw a trend line in. So gaming revenue in this place is trending upwards over the year, which is a good thing. Wages are also trending up. If you look at the distance between the lines, you can see, well, that's not quite at the same rate. Probably a good thing, but you might still ask the question, well, given that this is easy revenue to generate, and I don't mean to make that easy, say getting additional gaming revenue is easy, but it doesn't cost you much more in labour generally. So you might have expected that the wage line would have not grown in proportion.
actually used land, you know, anyway. We put in that digger upstairs, just under $3 million. He used the first graph we got, that type of graph there, brought it up. But because it was coming into action and all the rooms upstairs, we lost 2 of the big halls.
Yep.
There was going to be a lull at that point. Well, it was a lull, it was cold weather, the less people coming into your club and straight the whole band. And it was around and leaked up in there. That's a good graph.
Yeah, it is. But it's a matter of, again, what works for you and for your board. Here's another one with very simple information. Catering, how's catering trending? So the trend line is a proxy for year to date, almost. But Excel can do that for you very simply. It can make things, you can get, sometimes, I don't know if you ever see a graph, it's got so many lines on it, you just can't work it out. You may as well just cut it up and put it in the bin. There's no point making those sorts of graphs. If you can't look at it and glean a meaning of it from it pretty quickly, it's not achieving its purpose.
Isn't a good graph like compared, say January to January, have a blue line for this year and a red line for last year, and you can month by month.
Yep. Yeah.
Because they'll fall whether your football team playing at home or things like this, anything.
Yeah. And you can even have the little thought bubbles that people put on saying, well, this is explained by 4 public holidays or the wettest March on record or whatever it happened to be. But here we've got catering revenue. We've got catering margin percentage, which is hovering in the mid-60s, and that's probably reasonable for catering. If you saw a dead flat line in catering, you'd have to say it's a fiction story, because the cost of goods varies from day to day, week to week, month to month. So the margin has to vary. And if you can hold it in that range, I'd say you're probably doing well. The wages, a bit of a yo-yo in terms of percentage. So you probably just say, well, what's the story with our catering wages? There's a big upswing at the end here. So if you saw that continuing over a couple of months, and you'd see it very quickly, we've got this massive upswing, the line's heading north. What's going on? Question asked. You don't even have to understand what the numbers are. I won't labour the point. Same thing is done with all the key components of the business. What time are we supposed to finish? 3 o'clock. Okay. Yeah, I think you want to be finished at 3 o'clock, so because I can keep going for another hour if you want me to. Again, different types of graphs: profit and EBITDA. It's a matter of what works for you. There's one useful one here. This is the same graph presented in 3 different formats, just to show that you can present things differently. To me, that's almost useless. That's not much better, because the margin. Most people are going to look over here for a margin, for an axis, not over there. It's a matter of presentation. That's the point I'm making in this one. So it's not just the detail, it's actually how it's presented to you that is important. And maybe it's just me being an accountant. That's nice and tidy, things are on the left where they should be. That works for me. Yeah, and that's just more of the same. So this is presenting what a monthly repayment is for a bank debt, what the principal repayment is, and what the interest expense is. Does that really add any meaning to you month to month? It doesn't add much to me, but the best you can get from it, that I can see from this as a trend, is, well, yes, our interest expense is reducing and our principal repayment is increasing because the loan's getting repaid. But what else do you do with it? So when you get information, you look at it and say, yeah, okay, well, where's it go? If it goes nowhere, don't bother with it. Now, people would look at that possibly and say it's too busy, but don't jump to conclusions. So the thing in the back is the bank debt reducing, the 2 histograms. The orange one is interest cover, the greeny, yellowy one, whatever colour that is what the covenant is. So you can run your line across with a little bit of education about what the graph's showing. You can say, well, the bars are interest coverage covenant, and you can see we're above, so we're ticking that, our debt's reducing. Our principal and interest coverage ratio, the blue line's the covenant, what we have to meet, the purple line's what we're achieving. So you can look at that and get a picture of how you've dealt with bank debt, and it's all there in one. If people think it's too busy, then you can refine it and present it in different ways. There's another way of presenting it, all the same data. The bank debt line's not there, but the two covenants are there presented as lines. It's really, again, what works. You can put a data table in, all the same information, just presented differently, all with one click of a mouse, basically. So no excuse for sticking with something persistently. If people say it doesn't work, a couple of mouse clicks, you can change the way it looks, very simply. There's another way of doing it. So, at the end of the day, the format for reporting has to be user appropriate. I'm not saying don't present detailed financial information. I think you're obliged to do that. You have to prepare a proper set of monthly accounts. You have to table them. You have to have them available for people to look at, or for them to have a copy of, or download, however you distribute the information. But the decision making, the informing your board members and management team, for that matter, of what's going on in the business can be done in a very simple reporting format that you only have to look at to get a picture of. And I say to people, as directors of a club, you have to have the level of comfort with your club finances that is the same as you have at home. Normally someone says, my wife looks after the finances, or my husband looks after the finances. But assuming you're responsible for the household budget, you have to have the same level of understanding of that as you do of your club's position. How things are trending, how you're running, whether things are going well or not so well. It's that level of comfort that is what is needed. I won't dwell further. There's other report formats that are included in the material. We're running up on time. I just want to jump back a little bit about dealing with the bank. So we're looking at how you present information, you're managing the business. Your historical performance will guide what the bank will do for you. So if you have a track record of consistent profitability, the bank will perceive you as a lower risk opportunity than a club that comes to them that says 1 year they're in profit, next year and then they're in loss, then they're in profit, then they're in loss. No consistency to it at all. So the track record will influence how you're dealt with and how much it costs you to borrow money. So that consistency from year to year is important. So being able to use information to track and respond to emerging issues in the business is obviously critical to maintain that consistency. If your revenue is dropping, you need to respond. So if you pick that up quickly by seeing it in a report format that you understand. If your costs are blowing out, you pick that up quickly by seeing it in a report format that you understand, that tracks the right information. Because at the end of the day, consistency is important. You need to understand your debt capacity and plan for contingencies when you're borrowing money. Don't always say it'll be on the most optimistic basis that we will undertake this project. Provide for a little bit of pessimism. When I say that, conservatism is worthwhile. Don't have everything running at its limits. And there's some pretty simple rule of thumb. You can do some very basic calculations on how much you can afford to borrow. We've got a little tool here, which we use when we're talking to people about how much they can borrow. We just play around with EBITDA and interest coverage, and we can very quickly say, well, all things being equal, you can, this example is on a $1.7 million EBITDA. We're saying, or what this is saying is that they can probably get up to a total debt of around 6.5 million if they're borrowing over 7 years at 6%. Why do we say that? Because well, it's a little bit low there, but that principal interest coverage ratio needs to be 1.5 to meet normal bank covenants. The interest coverage ratio needs to be over 3, that's at 4.61. So broadly, they're in the range of, with that EBITDA, being able to borrow about $6.5 million. Should they borrow that? Different question. In theory, planning, you might say, let's think about maybe being able to borrow 6 mil, but obviously a lot more detailed work required, but that gives you a sort of a starting point. So when you're thinking of a project, well, we're currently chunking out this sort of EBITDA, how much money can we borrow? You can go through this sort of exercise and come up with a number. And the way it works, it calculates the bank covenant outcomes, and the bank covenants always build in free cash. So even after paying the debt back, there's still, in this case, out of the $1.7 million EBITDA, there's still $560,000 available for CapEx generally. So that's the buffer if things don't go quite as planned. And rule of thumb number there, for every $100,000 in EBITDA, basically $500,000 in borrowing capacity at 6% for a 7-year loan. And that'll probably make sense if you've got current debt. I've already given you some of these. These are just other little experiences that I've had where clubs have done things well and not so well. The first one is a large workers' club, and they're quite happy for me to talk about it, but I just normally don't put their name in print. It's Reesby Workers' Club. They went through a planning process that started in 2004. They borrowed a very large amount of money, and their project was finally finished construction in 2014. 10 years in planning and dealing with the bank. How did they do it? They spent a lot of money on advice, and that's not just with me, with lawyers, with cost consultants, with architects, with town planners. They did it properly. They actually got a plaque from the National Australia Bank for Governance. One of the senior executives from NAB came up from Melbourne to give them a plaque to say that their governance processes were superior to most of the Australian Stock Exchange listed companies that they dealt with. Now, if that's not a tick for the club industry, I don't know what is. So that's a story from the good side. And remember, you heard it here, right? It's not all bad stories. So, you know, there are clubs that do things very well, and that's one of them. But you know, they track all those key indicators religiously on all of their business units, and they've got plenty of them: fitness centre, health centre, medical centre, retail shopping centre, childcare centre, and about, I don't know, 5 or 6 food outlets now. So they track them all quite diligently. The last 3 are horror stories where they've got involved with a friendly developer. And the first one is the Leagues Club. It ended up amalgamating. They had a developer that came along and said, we'll do a free feasibility study for you. Won't cost you a cent. And the feasibility study was basically a crock. It was completely false. The GST calculations in it were wrong. Their market value assumptions were wrong. They basically were just taking this club for a ride and hopeful of getting a development opportunity. Fortunately, they got cut off at the pass, but it left the club in a position where it had to amalgamate, and it did successfully. The other 2, the last 2, Adamstown RSL and Mayfield Sports Club, are both gone. Adamstown, same sort of deal. A development proposal that was never approvable. Club got tied up in paying lots of money, and it just was completely outclassed in terms of being run around the bush by this particular party, and the ultimate happened there. It went into liquidation and closed. Mayfield Sports Club, same sort of thing happened. And you know, the things you see get put to people when they don't have the opportunity for advice or the experience. I mean, it's easy for me to make these comments that things look silly, but you know, I've had 17 years as an insolvency practitioner. I've seen most of the rorts. I've worked in the club industry for 20, so there's a lot of different commercial experience and exposure that I've had. And I see some of the things that get put in front of people, and they haven't had that experience. And like in the case of Mayfield, they said, oh, we'll just take a partial caveat over your property. Now, this club, Mayfield, didn't take any legal advice. They just relied on the developer. And I don't know if any of you have any understanding of land titles, but a partial caveat is a complete fiction. The land title is either subject to a caveat or it's not. But this thing was this imaginary caveat. They even presented a drawing to them and said, here's where we're going to lodge the caveat over this part of the property. Anyway, a $20 million damages claim came from that particular developer, which was fought and Club won. But again, the damage was too significant, it couldn't be saved. But those three are all of these friendly developer types coming through. Trust me, you'll be right. And none of them had proper advice. Look, that's right on time for this. Hopefully you've got something out of it. It is a pretty regular subject, operational finance. When I say it's a regular subject, it's something that is really the basics of business. So I'm happy to have any questions, or if you want, answer any questions later. But it really comes down to making sure you understand what's put in front of you, making sure that it gives you the information you need. And the really important thing is the advice is always cheaper at the front end. If you get it at the back end, it's going to be so much more expensive because the issues are so much more complicated. And you know, ask anyone that's been involved with a dispute of any sort. If you'd have sorted it out at the front end, you don't have the problems at the back end. So don't penny pinch on advice, whether it's commercial or legal or whatever advice it needs. If you don't have the skills around your table to make a proper assessment or to have all of the information to decide on something, go and get the advice, go and pay for it. And if you can't afford the advice, there's probably a lesson in that. You've got other questions to answer.